Arizona set up a public financing scheme for its state elections in which the public, taxpayer supported, the public would finance the costs of campaigning so that the candidates for office didn't have to spend all the time scaring up money and making campaign promises that would appeal to potential donors, and the whole appearance of corruption problem that surrounds trying to raise money from individuals and corporations to finance your campaign. So they set up a public financing campaign whereby the state would provide money to the candidates who elected to participate in it. Up to a certain amount of money the state would provide. And the scheme worked this way. If a privately financed candidate, you weren't required to participate in the public financing scheme, if a privately financed candidate raised more money than the allotment for the publicly financed candidate, the state would make up the difference. And if the privately financed candidate plus any independent expenditures on his or her behalf exceeded the public financing allotment, then the state would make up the difference, providing matching funds to match the private and independent funds raised by the opponent. For example, if you were the publicly financed candidate, the allotment might have been $2 million for your campaign. And if your opponent, privately financed, raised $1.5 million, less than you, but independent sources supporting your opponent raised $1 million, the total would be $2.5 million against your $2 million. The state would make up the difference and put $500,000 more in your campaign, matching funds. Well, it was challenged by the Republican Party and others in Arizona. The scheme was, and the case went to the Supreme Court, where at argument, Chief Justice Roberts leaned in and asked a question of the lawyer for the state defending the public financing scheme, and asked the lawyer, what's the purpose of this? Isn't it to level the playing field? And the lawyer said, no, it's about corruption, preventing corruption and the appearance of corruption. And Roberts said, well, I checked your website this morning, and it said that the purpose of the law was to level the playing field. He ambushed the lawyer in that way. And of course, as we learned from Citizens United, leveling the playing field is not a permissible justification for government to impose restrictions on campaign speech. And sure enough, the court held 5-4 with the usual political conservative liberal breakdown. In an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, the court held that this public financing scheme burdened political speech, impermissibly burdened political speech, pointing out that for every dollar spent over the allocation by a privately financed candidate results in a payment to the privately financed candidate's opponent. And for independent groups, Chief Justice Roberts pointed out they don't get any public financing, so they can avoid having this triggering effect, subsidizing the opponent, only by not speaking at all. Speaking in the sense of spending money. Over and over in the decision, Roberts really characterized money as speech. This is as close as the court has ever gotten to actually saying the words that money is speech. For example, he said that Arizona gives money, quote, in direct response to the campaign speech of the opponent. But it's not in response to the speech, it's simply in response to the dollars raised by the opponent, really considering money as speech. Justice Kagan dissented in the case, and her approach was more consistent with our First Amendment tradition. She said this law doesn't burden speech, it provides for more speech in the best First Amendment tradition. It enables more speech to occur during a political campaign because there's more money to finance it. And Chief Justice Justice Stephen Breyer, at the argument of the case, where it became obvious to him which way the wind was blowing among the other justices, he said we might as well give up on efforts to reform campaign finance. And that may be where we are, that the current five-justice majority of the court is so opposed to efforts to limit spending in political campaigns that they wouldn't uphold any law that has that result. Does that public financing scheme really burden speech? How does it burden speech? But the court said that it does because there's sort of a penalty for having raised too much money, and that is the state's going to give your opponent money. Well, what are we going to do? What can we do? Those of you who are opposed to the results in Citizens United, who are favorably disposed towards limiting the effect of money in campaign, what can be done post Citizens United? Well, there are some legislative things that can be done. For example, you could have more complete and more timely disclosure of who is contributing to campaigns or entities like super PACs and nonprofits that independently support or oppose candidates. The disclosure provisions that the court upheld in Citizens United are not very comprehensive, and they don't require timely. I mean, you could have real-time, given our technology, you could have real-time disclosure of who is kicking into which campaign online every day. Instead, the super PACs have to report quarterly. Sometimes that's after the election has taken place. There has been legislation introduced in the Congress called the Disclose Act, which doesn't seem to be going anyplace. I don't see how it would ever get through the current House of Representatives. That would require, in the advertisements themselves, disclosure of who funded this advertisement, the big funders of this organization that's taken off the ad. That would be very illuminating to the voters, I think, to know who's really behind these attacks. but that law doesn't seem to have any traction in Congress. Justice Stevens, in his dissent in Citizens United, suggested some legislative fixes that might help a little bit. In particular, he said that state laws, corporations are creatures of the states, the states' corporate laws and corporation laws could be amended to make it difficult or even impossible for corporations chartered in any particular state to spend shareholders' money on political causes. Or they could be required, the corporations could be required to have a shareholder vote before they spent the shareholders' money on these things. But those two don't seem to have had any real traction. There have been a couple, more than a couple, there have been some suggestions that the Constitution should be amended to deal with Citizens United. And Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, from Vermont, proposed a 28th Amendment. It would be the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution, in which he basically provided that for-profit corporations don't have any constitutional rights. Nonprofits would, but not for-profit corporations, which would, of course, disable the New York Times, CBS News, and all the media corporations. They would no longer have First Amendment rights under this proposed amendment, which I think needs some work. And then Congressman McGovern proposed a constitutional amendment that deals with corporate personhood and provides that corporations are not persons. He would include nonprofit corporations, the Sierra Club, the ACLU, and so on. They wouldn't have personhood anymore. And his amendment doesn't speak to elections at all. And you have to be careful about undertaking amending the Constitution, especially tinkering with the First Amendment. That's a dangerous undertaking. Who knows what kinds of ornaments that various factions in our society might want to hang on that Christmas tree if we're talking about changing the First Amendment. Authorize prayer in school, require prayer in school, that sort of thing. So I'm not a big fan of undertaking to amend the Constitution. I think that the most practical and straightforward way of going would be legislative, much more disclosure. But if I were writing a constitutional amendment, I'd deal with the problem, which is that political campaigns and their funding need to be regulated. And my amendment would say, nothing in this is the 28th Amendment, according to me, nothing in this Constitution shall prevent Congress or any state from reasonably regulating and limiting contributions and expenditures relating to elections. That would effectively overrule Citizens United. My amendment won't go anyplace either. Probably the long-term solution to Citizens United is to have one of the conservative five retire and be replaced, and then they can do to Citizens United, the new court could do to Citizens United what the five in Citizens United did to the earlier precedent there. So that's Citizens United, the most important First Amendment case of the century. And I have some questions about it before we go on to an entirely different subject. Everybody got a good handle on Citizens United? You know what the court decided? You know why they decided it? No lingering doubts. Really? Great. You guys are on the case. So now let's talk about writing. I finished reading the other night Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. I think it's the third time that I read it. I read it for the first time when I was in college. And I read the new edition that came out, I think, last year, that has 30-some different endings in the book that Hemingway wrote. And the book includes his handwritten manuscript. He wrote out the book by hand. And includes his cross-outs and his changes and his delineations and so on. And the meticulous care that he put into that ending is amazing. 30-some different, some of them are very subtly different, and some of them are radically different. The story really came out differently. The baby didn't die. His lover didn't die at the end, but of course she did, and then he walked out in the rain. But I was so struck in reading the book this last week by his writing and how clear and pure it was, how direct, how short the words were, how every word counted. And I paid particular attention to that because I knew your paper was coming up next week, and I wanted you to write like Hemingway. He was, after all, a journalist, among other things. He wrote a lot of newspaper accounts and so on. So I thought we ought to talk a little bit about writing, or avoiding bad writing. Some disclaimers. I am completely unqualified to teach writing. I have no credentials. There are people whose profession is teaching writing. I'm not one of them. Ben Yagoda is one of them. I provided the link to the little 5-page thing he did about avoiding bad writing in the assignment for the paper next week. How many of you read that, have read Yagoda's suggestions? A handful? Why would you not want to read what an expert says, here are the problems with student writing and how to avoid them? I don't understand why you wouldn't pay attention to that. Another disclaimer, I don't remember. I had an 8th grade English teacher, Miss Rutan, who was an embittered, dried up, old, humorless teacher who kept making us diagram sentences and go over vocabulary and recite the parts of speech and how they related to each other and so on, drill after drill after drill. And nobody could enjoy her teaching, but I'm so glad that she did that. I got some grammar. I got some instinctive sense for grammar, at least. I get the impression that in California schools these days, possible exception of Catholic schools, grammar is not taught anymore. And so you arrive at the University of California with an inadequate background in writing good English. And what I don't want to have happen, but I'm afraid has been happening for many years now, is that people graduate with degrees from the University of California at Berkeley who are unable to write coherent, clear English. And so here's my feeble attempt to try to help. I don't remember how to diagram a sentence. I don't remember the names of the parts of speech. But I do recognize common mistakes that are made in writing. And over the years, there seem to be patterns of mistakes that I see over and over again that are real simple to fix and real simple to understand. So what I have done is compile some examples of these patterns, and we'll go over and we'll play a little game with them. But first, let me just mention some vocabulary things about talking about things in discourse. The Supreme Court, when it decides something, will often say, we hold something or other. That is, we decide something or other. When you say that the court holds something, you mean that it decides. Saying that the court upholds that there's no First Amendment right, something is not right. They might uphold a statute. They might uphold a lower court decision, but they don't uphold something in the sense of deciding it. There is no such thing as a trial in the Supreme Court of the United States. No cases are tried in the Supreme Court of the United States. The trial's in a trial court, a district court, or a superior court in California, and then it's appealed to an appellate court, and then they go to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no trial there. There's no witnesses. There's no testimony. Don't talk about trials in the Supreme Court. Similarly, verdicts happen only in trial courts. A jury comes in with a verdict. There's no verdict in the Supreme Court. There's no verdict in an appellate court. And frequently, students will write about, well, the court decided such and such. The court argues that, or the court claims that, Well, the courts don't argue, and courts don't claim. They decide, or they reason in some way or another. And then just some of my little pet peeves. Don't use the word said in referring back to something that was just happened, the said case or the said party in this case or something. That is an old-fashioned 19th century legalism. Don't use it. And don't try to write like a 19th century lawyer. Don't dress it up, whatever you're writing, in legalese in any way, but certainly don't use said. I would recommend not using the word deems either. Something or other deems that. Sort of trite, often misused. Avoid that. Avoid slashes. As you see, if you bothered to look at my rules on good writing, don't use slashes. Slashes only introduce ambiguity. Make up your mind. It's either one or the other. And you can say or instead of your slash. But if you put in a slash, which one do you mean? Don't use slashes. And use an exclamation point only when you really, really mean this is extraordinary. You can use an exclamation point. I know in texting and emails and so on, you run off a lot of exclamation points. Don't do it in writing. Okay, here's the game. Last year, the paper assignment last year was to take the case of United States versus Alvarez. We've touched on it briefly. Alvarez is the guy who lied about receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor and was convicted under a statute, the Stolen Valor Act, and sentenced to prison. And he appealed, and the Court of Appeals found the statute unconstitutional, the violation of the First Amendment. And the government took the case to the United States Supreme Court. Well, at the time last year's students were writing their paper about Alvarez, the case had not been decided yet. It wasn't decided until June 28th last year. But the assignment was pretend that the court decided the Alvarez case yesterday, or today. You're writing the news article reporting the decision. That was the assignment. The assignment for the spring, I haven't written yet, but it'll be something like that. Something similar to that. So that was the assignment. And it included asking the students to describe the opinions in the court, including identifying who wrote any opinion in the case. And so the students turned in their papers. Now, what I have assembled is a bunch of excerpts from the papers that the students turned in that are typical. These are not isolated instances of mistakes with poor writing. They are fairly typical of what I got last year and what I've seen over the years. So I want you to pay attention to what they say and to test your editorial acuity. Keep track as we go along of how many of the common mistakes you were able to spot in each of these. And we'll talk about them as we go. You got a question? It's terrible. I don't know what this one. It's got a loose connection, obviously. I'm sorry. That's not my department. So here's one. The first. Take a second and let me know if there are any problems in that excerpt. Yeah. It's what? It's way too long. The sentence is too long? Yeah, it's even more fundamental than that about the sentence. What's the problem? Well, there's a quotation mark. That's a problem. What about stick with the sentence for a second? Passive voice. Beg your pardon? Oh. Stated by Alvarez to Alvarez stated. Yeah, it is. And it would be more effective. I don't consider that a mistake, using the passive voice. This is not as good a writing as if you use the active voice. As you suggested, it would be much more Hemingway-esque to use the active voice. Nicole? Yeah, well, you guys are getting going. But the one fundamental problem is